Our gospel passage today is John 9, 1 through 41. As he went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it in the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes open?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it in my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees who asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud in my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know that he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" And Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim to see, your guilt remains." In the second verse it says, his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" We don't know very much about who God is. Because Jesus said neither this man or his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God may be displayed in him. This man who was a beggar because he was blind, a man probably not thought of much by his fellow man, parents who probably wondered, why has this happened to us? But Jesus said they hadn't sinned. That's not what caused this. But it did it to glorify God. Also did it to confront the church of that day and the church leaders of that day. After saying this, he spit on the ground and made some mud. It's the Sabbath. He's working. He told him to go wash. And we see right away the teachers, the law in the synagogue, the Pharisees, that they said, well, it's the Sabbath. And therefore, the fact that Jesus did this on the Sabbath, he couldn't be a man of God. He's a sinner. They judged him to be a sinner. I marvel how many times in here it talks about they accused Jesus of being a sinner because how could he wouldn't have worked on the Sabbath and opened the man's eyes. And then over in verse 34, they accused the blind man of being a sinner. You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? We're talking today about the will of God and spiritual blindness. When I came to Scott Depot, I had heard Reverend Morgan, and I heard Pastor Hogue, and I perceived that they were men that were endeavoring to walk with God. But then I had heard so much about another man negative mostly. But the two men that I most looked up to, Pastor Hogue and Brother Morgan, looked up to him. So here they are, here I am, and here he is. I couldn't see who he was. So I made a decision, and that decision was I'm going to accept Reverend Helm on the basis of who they are.
Yes, sir.
Who Pastor Hogue and who Brother Morgan.
Right.
And I watched and I listened and I found out that I was dealing with spiritual blindness. Where I was at, I couldn't see. On the tape, Forsaking All, I'm listening to Reverend Helm preach, and God's helping him. And he makes a statement that if we're not where we need to be spiritually, if we haven't kept the essentials, read, pray, witness, and obey, if we have any jealousy, criticism, judgment in our hearts, he said, you're only going to maybe, I don't know if we could hear it all if we had those, but he said, if we haven't kept the essentials, he said, you're only going to hear me in fragments.
Wow.
And I see that in my own life, there's times we only see in fragments because our hearts aren't pure. Where we've asked God to forgive us, we're endeavoring to walk, but we can't see. Don, it goes back to what you said a few minutes ago. Earlier, starting out, trusting God to know what he's saying when he speaks. Because unless God helps us, we're only going to hear in fragments. We're only going to get bits and pieces. And then there's a great danger if we're just getting bits and pieces, we can misinterpret what he's saying to us.
Yes, true.
Yes.
The spiritual leaders of that day could not recognize who Jesus was. They could not see who he was. They were blinded. They were blinded by their own judgment. They were blinded by them thinking who they were, that they were somebody. They were blinded by the position of power and control.
Yes.
And we know this because in the next lines, they call the parents in. And they ask the parents, is this your son? Well, how did this happen? Well, he's of age, ask him. Because of the fear of being thrown out of the synagogue.
Right.
They didn't want to get thrown out of the church.
Right.
Because the religious leaders had said that anyone who says that Jesus is the Messiah will be thrown out of the synagogue. We'll throw you out. Listening to one of the tapes, Reverend Helm was talking about the calling of an apostle. And if an apostle came to the church, most churches today, would he have a place? Would he have a place? Would he fit? Because the spiritual leader of the day is apostles, prophets, and yet we have committees, we have boards deciding what's to take place. So Jesus can't get in most churches because it's being controlled just like the church was controlled in Jesus' day,
Yes.
and there's blindness.
Yes. Yes, sir.
And when the supernatural takes place, when something supernatural takes place, it confronts the blindness.
Yes, true.
And then the blindness wants to hold on to its status, its position, its place. They ask him, "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." And truly, yes, and more than a prophet. But he had enough to know that he was a prophet. He was from God. He knew that this had to be a man of God.
Right.
He recognized that. And then on over, they said to him, they hurled insults at him. "We follow Moses." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes." Now listen to this. "We know that God does not listen to sinners." We're talking about sinners again. They've accused him of being a sinner. They've accused Jesus of being a sinner. And he says to them, "We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will." Nobody has ever opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. In verse 27 of chapter 8, it says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing of my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me. The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. As we do what God directs, he's with us. His protection, his shield, his covering, his angels are round about. And you felt it this week
Yes, I did.
as you were there, sitting at your computer, not expecting it.
Right.
I was talking to Don, I think, Thursday, and said something about God. He felt God working, and he said he's so surprised. And I said, oh, it's always a surprise.
Yes.
When he speaks, when he operates, when he works, it's always a surprise.
Yes.
And it's exciting
Amen.
when he does. He was a prophet, yet he was more.
Yes.
Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him. Now, that tells me he went looking for him. Mm-hmm. Jesus went looking for him. Oh, I got excited, you know. You know, the man has been rejected by the church. He's been thrown out. He's declared that Jesus is a prophet. So Jesus wants to find him. And I think it's so sweet. He says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he says, who is he, sir? He addresses him with respect.
Yes.
Sir, who is he? Sir. You know, sometimes in the military, you know, sir, mm-hmm. Sir, there's this respect.
Yes.
And I'll tell you what, when I'm with young men and different ones, and they show the respect, and we use the word sir, it's encouraging. But he had respect for who Jesus was.
Yes.
Tell me that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you have now seen him. I couldn't have seen him earlier. He's blind.
Right.
Man, there's a lot of little things about blindness in
Yes.
this and not seeing and what causes blindness. You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into the world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. I remember being in services at Scott Depot, where God worked wonderfully. And I can see different ones of childlike faith who would stand to testify. And the judgment would fall from the people upon them. Why are you getting up? And yet, many times, God would operate with me as they spoke. They were up excited.
Yes. Yes.
I remember Rosalie Parsons
Oh, yeah.
would get up and she'd be happy about Jesus. People would want her to sit down. The good church people.
Yeah.
A wonderful church.
Jesus helps.
There were others. Jesus in verse 14 of chapter 8, but you have no idea where I come from or where I'm going. You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one. But if I do judge, my decisions are true because I am not alone. I stand with the Father. Jesus did not come to judge us.
Right.
He did not judge the lady at the well last week.
Right.
He does not judge us. But he has available for anyone who will go after him, come after him, take up their cross and follow. In a little while, he will be speaking and working. It may be a few days, a few weeks, or months, but I know that it's anyone. It's available for all of us.
Yes. Yes.
This walk with God is available for everyone. I believe this blind man
Jesus.
was pretty excited. The man who was shamed as a beggar, now he's being shamed as a believer. It's pretty amazing that the Jewish people and the synagogues and all the ones worshiping at that time had been taught they were looking for the Messiah to come. And yet, did it cut off? Yet they could not understand or they could not recognize who he was. They had developed positions. They had developed control, power, control of the people, the leaders. And because of it, they were blinded. They thought themselves to be something. They thought themselves to be something. We're believers of Moses. We follow Moses. God spoke to him. Boy, little did they know that the Son of God was speaking to them, but they couldn't see it. God wants us to be able to hear. And he wants us to be able to hear not just in fragments, but he wants us to be able to hear clearly. And he wants us to be able to follow. But to do it, we have to know that he's everything. Jesus says, I am with thee. We have to know within our heart that there's no good thing in me. No good thing except Christ. And oh, what a journey it will be. Because along the way, he'll speak to us. He'll give us words of encouragement. He'll have something happen that'll be a story we'll be so excited about that we want to call our friends and tell them. Those that are believers. Because we want to review it. May God help us not to judge. May God help us to know that it's all in him and not in us. And because he truly is a mighty fortress. And with his help, we can make it. Only with his help, day by day. Through this situation we're in our land,
Yes.
he can help us through it.
Yes, sir.
He can work with us. He can help us to know what to do, and he can help us to rest.
Yes.
We can pray for those suffering, for those that have lost loved ones, but he's in charge.
Amen.
That's what one of the songs said earlier. He's in control by God's grace.